In this video, I want to show you a couple different ways how to design your UI for form validation. Well, what does that mean? Okay, I've got an example right here, and it's just like a create account form, and I'm going to put in an email, and you can see this button down here. I can't click on it right now, but when I put in a good old password, all of a sudden it becomes active and I can click on it. Now, this is an important part of designing your app because in the great book by Don Norman called The Design of Everyday Things, he talks about how you should always be communicating the system status to your users. And that means that your app is going to do a lot of processing of information. You're going to be sending information. You're going to be calculating information, and that takes some time. And so you want to be communicating that to your users. Or here we've got a form, and we want to be communicating if the user has filled out all the correct information. And so we do that by both the color of the button and the disable and enabling it. So let me show you how to do this in FlutterFlow. So we're here in FlutterFlow, basic form. We've got a text field input right here for email and your password, and then we just got a button. So if you scroll down to the bottom here, you're gonna see this disable button right here. And so if we just click it on, we're given two additional options. First, we have a disabled color right here, and I put a gray. Normally, desaturated colors are gonna be your best design decision for disabled buttons. You don't wanna go with like another color because it's just gonna confuse the users. So a gray or a desaturated color of your main buttons will work well. So I've got my color here, and then up here, I have a condition. And that is, if I just set this to true right down here in our constants, this is just going to say, yes, it's true that this is disabled. So let's just go take a look at this. So here we've got our gray button, you can't click on it, and so that's disabled. So if this is false, if whatever is in here evaluates to false, then the button will be active. And if the button is active, that means you can perform any actions on here. Because normally when you have a user click a button, you're going to want to process some information, send it to a database, navigate them to a new page. When it's disabled, you can't do any of that. So it's not just a visual cue. Okay, so how are we gonna set up this logic? What we want is we want this to be true. We want a condition to evaluate to true when it's disabled. Okay, so how are we gonna do that? Well, we have to check something about this email field and something about this password field. So really, we need two conditions. So we can come in here to our conditions, and we can see that we've got combine multiple conditions. That's what we want. We wanna evaluate these two fields. Now you might think, oh, well, let's just drop in our widget state. We got two widgets, we've got those two inputs, so we could just dump this in here, this email and this password. But that's not gonna work because this is looking at the text. You can see this in here. If you go in to our widget state, we can see here, this is telling us what type this is, and these are text types, strings. But what we really want is a Boolean, a true or false. Because remember, what we want in here is we want to set up the conditions so it's true that it's disabled. We don't want to just evaluate this text in here. We want to check a Boolean, a true or false value. And we do that by coming into the conditions here. And we want to check a single condition. And the first one is going to be the email address. And if you come in here, equal or not equal to would be if we wanted to look at what that text actually is. Say if you had john@gmail, you could check it against other email addresses. But no, we want to come down here. This is set and not empty, because this is going to give us a Boolean, a true or false value. That is this set and not empty? So like, is there something in there? True or false? Now, when we're doing a bunch of sort of nested true or false values, it can get kind of tricky. So I'm going to show you first the way not to do it and explain you why that's wrong. So we might think, and this is the wrong way, that we want to say, oh, we're looking for if this is not set or empty. Like we want to look for if those text fields are empty because then we're going to disable it. Okay, so let's do that. Let's confirm it. Let's do the same thing for the password field. Checking that condition, grabbing that password field saying it's not set. So we're looking, oh, it's empty. Cool. All right. So now we have, remember, we're looking for this disabled to be true. And so this is going to evaluate to true if it's empty. And this will evaluate to true if it's empty. Confirm. And let's test it out. Let's see what happens. And our password, and it's not working. And that's because we set up some logic on this button. And so when we loaded the page, it checked for that condition. So when the page loads, it looked at these two inputs and there was nothing in them. So of course it's disabled. We added some text in, but that logic didn't run again. Behind the scenes, it didn't call set state again. So we have to set one more thing on these inputs. So if you come back into each of your inputs and scroll down, you can see this property, update page on change. That is, when this changes, when you type stuff in here, the page will update. Now, this doesn't mean completely refresh. This means that anything that has state bound to it, that is, anything that has dynamic information or logic that needs to evaluate. So for instance, this text here is static text. This is static text as well. So this wouldn't refresh because it doesn't need to. But we have some logic on our button here that is bound to the state of these two inputs. So that will get re-rendered. But Flutter is smart. So it's not going to re-render everything. It's only going to need to re-render what it needs to. So the only thing that's bound to the state that changes here is the background color. So that's going to be the only thing that gets reevaluated. So you don't have to worry about flashes of content on your page, like it's completely refreshing. Okay, so when we go into our input here, we've checked our button, and then we see we've got this update delay in milliseconds. And what this is saying is that when you type, how long do we want to wait before the page is updated? Now, if you do too long, so if we did like 5 seconds right here, that would mean that when we typed in here and typed in here, we would have to wait 5 seconds before this button would become active. That would be too long. The user would probably click away or think that there was some error. If we do it too short, say if we put it at 10 milliseconds, we'd start worrying about performance, because that means with every keystroke, you're going to be re-rendering stuff on the page. Now, of course, for this page, it wouldn't really matter because there's not a whole lot going on here. But you can imagine if you've got a list of data with names and images, maybe a filter set up, then you want to be careful about it. This would be more applicable to things like search. So 50 to 100 milliseconds is a pretty good range. And you want to do the same thing to your other input, and now it should work. All right, so let's put in our email address. And all of a sudden, we're told that we can create an account. But that's not right, because our button should only become active once we have an email and a password in here. So what's going on? So if we come back into our conditions here, let's make this a little bit bigger and think through what just happened in that scenario. So when we ran the app, the button was disabled. Why is that? Well, because both of these things were unset. So this whole thing right here evaluated to true, because this is true and this is true. And so when we get true, it's disabled. But then we put in our email address. So then this is false. So false always wins. And so this evaluated to false. It's not disabled. Okay, well, does that mean we have to go to or here? Well, let's see what happens. So here's our app. We got a disabled button. And when we put in our email and password, and that works. Why? Well, let's look at this. So if we come into our conditions here, we can see that what we're saying is if this is true or this is true, if the email is empty or the password is empty, I want this to be true. Once again, true means disabled. So if this is empty, I want it to be disabled, or if this is empty, I want this to be disabled. Okay, great. Now, if you have additional conditions you want to check for, that is other inputs that you want to make sure your user fills out, you can just make another condition down here, or even better yet, copy this and then paste the variable in. So you just have to reset this field over here and go into your widget state and just pick the new input out of there. All right, great. So let's put our email address in. Awesome. Let me show you another way how to set up form validation. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create two local state variables. And these will be used to keep track of whether those input fields are actually filled out. And we're going to create one for each of them. So we're just going to call this email state, and it'll be a Boolean, and password state. Also a Boolean, true or false. So we're going to start out with these as false, so unchecked. And we're going to say that if it's true, there will be a border, and if not, there won't be. So true means you got more stuff to fill out. Okay, next, let's bind our borders to those variables. So let's come into our email and scroll down to our border, set our border color from a variable. It's going to be a local state variable, but of course we don't have access here because what we're having to set is an actual color. So after our logic is done, what this wants is a color. So we can't set it from the local state. We're going to have to set it from a conditional. And now this makes sense. If this condition is true, then this will be the color, and we'll set that. If not, we'll set this color. So like we said before, if our email state, then we want the border to be telling us that we got to fill it out. So what's that going to be? Well, it's going to be some sort of like red or orange. And you want to use a color that typically indicates that something is incomplete or it's wrong or it needs attention. So we're going to go with red. And if not, we're just going to give it a white color. Okay, great. And we'll do the same thing with our password field. So that's all great. So let's test it out and see where we're at. Okay, so there's nothing filled in right now. So shouldn't it be red? Well, no, because when we first go to this page, we don't want it to be indicating that there's some problem. We don't want to see a border right there because the user hasn't had an opportunity to do any of this yet. And this is actually one of the nice features of how we set up our local state variables, because we started them out as false. So they're false when the page loads. But once we start checking for the state, once we run the logic again, then we'll get the indication of the border. Okay, so now we have to set up our logic. That is, our local state variables are currently set to false, but there's no mechanism, there's no logic for turning them to true. And there's really two scenarios where we want these things to change. We want them to change when we type into these fields and when we click on create account. So let's do our create account logic first. And what we're gonna be doing is when we click on create account, we wanna evaluate if the user has filled in these fields. And if they have, then we can just move on in our app. If they haven't, we wanna show that border. Well, how do we do that? Well, we do that by changing that local state variable, because that border is bound to our local state variable. The user will click on this button, we'll look at these fields, and then we'll change those local state variables based on the state of these fields. So let's go do that. So let's come into our button right here, go into our action flow editor, open it up, because this is going to be a little bit more complex. We're going to start out with a conditional action because we are checking for the state of those widgets. There are really multiple ways that we could handle this. For instance, with nesting our conditions together, because we have two conditions to check. But let's just do them sequentially, because I think it's easiest to follow and to visually see. So first, we're going to check the condition of our email widget. That is, if anything is filled out. And just like before in our button disable example, we can't just go into our widget state right here. We have to get a Boolean, a true or false out of it. That's what we're looking for right here. So we come into a single condition. We want to look at the widget state of our email address. And we want to check if it is set, if the user has filled out anything in there. Okay, so if they have filled something out, then we want that local state variable to be false. We don't want to show a border because they don't have to do anything. So let's add an action. We're going to look for local state, looking for this email state, and we are going to set the value, specific value to false. That's great. Now down here it says update type. This is asking us, what do we want to update? What do we want to rerun our set state on? Do we want to do it on all the pages in our app, just the current page, or no rebuilding? Well, we want to rebuild this current page. That is, we want any bound variables, any logic to be reevaluated on this page. And how you want this set here, you can figure out by just asking yourself the question, is this logic right here affecting anything else on the page or in my app? And if it is, well, then you want to rebuild this current page or rebuild all the pages, depending on what it's actually affecting. Right now, we're just dealing with the current page, so there we go. So if that's false, then this side is going to be true. So we could add it in here, but let's just copy over here because it makes it a lot easier. Paste action and switch it from false to true. That is, this condition is false, so there's nothing in that email input. So we want this variable to be true. That is, show the border, indicate to the user that they need to fill this out now. All right, great. So let's just test that out right now to see how it's working. All right, so if we just create a count right here, we can see beautiful. We get our border, we're telling our user, hey, you need to fill this out. So let's put this in and create now. Now it goes away. That's beautiful. So now let's just add in this logic for our password. And once again, the easiest way to do this is to just copy this condition and paste it in here and then change what we need to change. So we're not checking for this email. We are checking for password and we're applying the same logic. And then we need to just change which local state variable is changed. So let's just remove email state and add in password state. This should be set value to false, and this should be true, but not email state. We want our password state. Beautiful. Let's test it out. So create an account, and we can see we've got error states for both of these. That's beautiful. And if we just put something in here, those clear out. That's great. But let's take it a step further, because normally when you've got an error state, let's get one right here, and the user starts to type, we want to reward the user and remove this error state and say, okay, we see that you're dealing with this problem, and so we're going to take this away. So how could we do that? Well, we're going to do that by listening to the change event on these inputs. So let's come into our email address here, come over to our action flow editor, add an action, and we're going to listen for an onChange event. And let's open this up, come over to onChange, and we want to check for a condition. And same thing as before, we want to check the condition of that widget. So we're looking at the email widget. So we want to come in and just do the same logic. Single condition, want to look at our email address, and we want to check if it is set or not. Confirm. So if it is set, if someone has written some stuff in there, we don't want to show that border. We want it to be false. So let's add in our local state change, and we're listening to the email, and we want to set it to false. Don't show that border. You're writing it in, everything's cool. And once again, we don't need to rebuild all the pages, just the current one. And then the opposite for the other side. Paste that action in, same variable, different value. Great, let's test that out. So let's create our account. We got to fill this stuff out. So I say john@gmail.com. And it worked, but it kind of took long. Well, we can change it. Let me show you. So if you come into your properties panel down here and scroll down, you can see we've got this update page on change. And that was turned on when we set the rebuild current page in our local state variable. That's the same thing. And so now we can set our update delay. That's how much time it's going to wait before updating the page. So once again, let's just change that to like 100 right there. And let's retry. Create our account, we get our error messages, and then when I write in, it goes away immediately. Beautiful. So let's finish up by adding that same logic down here to our other button. So let's come over here. Let's copy this logic right here. Copy, and let's paste it in here. Make sure you're on the on change. Paste our actions. That's right. We're not listening to email here. We're listening to our password widget state. Beautiful. And we're changing a different local variable, not email, but password. And once again, this will be setting the value to false. Beautiful. And let's just grab this action, delete this, paste our new action in, and instead of false, we're setting it to true. And rebuild current page, that's right. And so let's run it again. And create account, errors, let's put in password. Let's create our account, error messages, put in an email there, and a password there. And beautiful. We've got a UI for form validation. Thanks so much for checking out this video. Let me know if you've got any questions below, and we'll see you in the next video.